Are you ready to grow your family tree? Not sure how to get started? That's okay, because in this beginner genealogy video, I'm going to get you started the right way. If you have been researching your ancestors for a while and are not new to genealogy, keep watching anyway. Going back to the basics is always a good exercise, no matter what level of researcher you are. Hey there, if we haven't met before, I am Lisa with Are You My Cousin? And this YouTube channel is designed to help you find your ancestors, grow your family tree, but not be overwhelmed in the process. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, you're in the right place. Now, oftentimes when we gather together with family at holidays or at family gatherings such as weddings or birthdays, we become inspired to learn more about our family history. And oftentimes it's these encounters that actually get people to take that first initial step into building the family tree out and researching who the ancestors were. But once that inspiration is there, the question quickly becomes to, how do I do it? Where do you start, right? The first steps of your genealogy research are actually fairly straightforward. And once you've mastered those, you'll have a good foundation for taking your research even further. And of course, you will want to take it further because you're going to be hooked on genealogy researcher, right? Okay, so today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com, as I mentioned at the top of the video. Newspapers.com is the largest newspaper archive online. And I absolutely love diving into those newspapers because they contain all the stories. They contain the stories of my ancestors that I'm not going to get anywhere else. It's a bit like a time machine, so to speak. Diving into those extensive newspaper archives allows us to, well, experience life as it was happening to our ancestors. With over 800 million digitized pages of newspapers that span 3 centuries, newspapers.com really does provide an unparalleled entry into the past. So for all those times that I actually wished I had a time machine, well, it turns out I did. Now, for listeners of today's show, newspapers.com is offering a 20% discount off of a publisher's extra subscription. Just use the code AreYouMyCousin at checkout. Begin to uncover those extraordinary details of your ancestors' life with newspapers.com today. Okay, so now let's get to building that family tree. Now, I think one of the reasons that we as researchers kind of get into genealogy research is because as we grow up or as we start as adults attending family get-togethers, whether it's a family reunion, whether it's a family wedding, we start to ask questions, we start to pull out old family photographs, and one thing leads to another, and the stories start to flow. I often say that a photograph is basically a conversation starter when it comes to finding your family history. And so this absolutely gets us thinking and remembering and connecting with others. So once you are ready to start that genealogy research, we have to follow some basic steps. And I think we're going to build your foundation for your research. Now, the really very first thing that I want you to do is actually start with what is already known in the family. Who knows what? Find out and ask. Now, don't overlook this step because you can waste valuable research time trying to find answers to questions that were actually already known and you could have found out in a phone call. So things like when you're with your family, ask about birth dates, ask about marriage dates, death dates. If they know just the year, that's fine. Ask about full names and nicknames. Be sure and ask about nicknames, guys. That can save you a lot of trouble later on trying to figure out who is whom when you're looking at the records so that you don't think you have 2 people when you only have 1. So make sure that you ask about that. Ask who has the family Bible, who has what in that family. So who has the family Bible, who has any of the family photographs, who has any of the family information out there. So make sure that you are asking because, again, if you can actually go and research all of this, absolutely. But if you skip this step, you can waste a lot of time and you can waste a lot of money getting copies of records that perhaps are already in the family. So I would encourage you to do that. Now, a word about this. Sometimes when we go to ask a family, the family member's like, I don't really know. They were born, sometime around 1935. They may not know the exact date. That's okay. That at least gives you a clue and a place to start researching further on. Same thing with family names and stuff. Maybe they do know the names, full names. Maybe they don't. That's okay. Whatever they think they know, go ahead and write it down because it could be a clue for use later on in your research. So don't overlook that fact. Just because they're not exact, that might not be valuable. All right. Once you've done that, the next thing that you want to look for are the vital records. Now, these records what we're talking about when we talk about vital records are birth, marriage, and death records. Relatively easy to find. There's definitely exceptions to that. But oftentimes you might find copies within the family. They could be tucked in a family Bible. They could be tucked among old family records. You never quite know. But I would definitely ask. So when you're in that initial phase of asking what is known, ask if any copies of records like this could be available to you. Now, next up, they are relatively easy to find because oftentimes they are kept at the county level. So these are county level records that would be filed at the county where the event happened. And so this would be where you would actually go to a courthouse or send off to a courthouse and ask for searches to get these records. So why are you looking for the birth, marriage, and death records? Well, you're looking for them because they have the person's name on it, obviously. It can give you, again, the birth date. It can give you a marriage date. A birth date a birth certificate such as the one on the screen here actually tells you who the parents, so it tells you who the parents are. A death record will also do the same thing, a death certificate, a marriage certificate as well, oftentimes. Sometimes yes, sometimes no on the marriage certificate. But you can get a lot of valuable information, not just on the actual event that is being talked about in that record. So for instance, this birth certificate is documenting the birth of this child, and it gives us the date of October 23rd, 1916. But what it's also giving us is both of her parents. It's telling us where her parents were born. It's telling us what their occupations were. So we know a little bit more about. So we have 2 generations on this family record. Okay, so that's why we're looking for these records and want to document these for us. Now these are relatively, like I said, easy to find. You may find some on ancestry.com, Find My Past, My Heritage, Family Search, the major genealogy databases, right? If you're not finding them, if it's a later one, then you're going to need to seek out the county courthouse and ask them for how to get a copy from them as well. There are some privacy issues that could be involved, so you may be limited access to some of the records that you might need. But for the most part, for the time periods that I tend to work in, at least, I usually have access to those. Now, one thing to remember, these can be fairly what I would call modern records. In other words, you want to find out when these records were actually started to be created by the state, when the state required the counties to document these records, because you don't want to find an actual birth certificate like this you would not find on someone who was born in 1850, because they were not creating this type of record at that time period. So you do want to make sure that you are when the records were required to be used, and so you would be able to you're not looking for records that didn't actually ever exist. Okay, census records would be the next thing. So once you've done your vital record research, and then I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and go straight into that census and work your way back. Now, census records. Okay, these are truly some of my favorite records, and the reason is they have so much fantastic information in them. And if you love a good census research project, go ahead and hit that thumbs up if you've had some experience with this in the past. If you've researched a little bit, maybe not a brand new beginner, hit that thumbs up button and let me know how much you like these to research in census records as well. I think one of the reasons we like them is that sometimes we can get some pretty good information really quick, and it's always nice to have a quick win. But if you're new to census research, let's just do a quick review here. All right, so the census records here in the U.S., at least in the U.S., are taken every 10 years. They started in 1790. They run up through 1950 as far as those that are available for the public to actually review. So they are not released for public viewing until 72 years after the event. So currently we only have access to 1790 all the way up through 1950. The 1890 census, unfortunately, most of it did not survive, so it is not searchable for us. And so that's an unfortunate loss. We often refer to that as the genealogy black hole, but that's okay. There are other ways to work around it. And if you will check out the other videos on my YouTube channel, you will find some great, fantastic ways to work around that 1890 census when you get there. All right, so census research, what you want to do is you want to start with the latest and work backwards and track your ancestors that way. So you can track your ancestors through the back through the census records, you're going to get varying amounts of information based on the year of that particular or census schedule. Not everyone asked the same things, and you'll find more information on the later ones, as you can imagine, and not as much information in the early ones. So the one that you see in front of you is actually from 1950. You can see it lists every person in the household. Now, how fabulous is that? Because that's what we're trying to do, is document families and family households. It tells us who the head is. It tells us the relationship of each individual in the family, their relation to that head of that household. And that's a really fabulous way to understand the relationships. We get ages, we get months of that somebody was born. We can get where they were born. So we can get quite a bit of information here on an individual. So definitely the biggest tip I can give you here when you're looking at any census record, and any of these, would be to make sure you read every single column and record it, and take your time in the census record. So you want to track your ancestor. And once you found them in 1950 and you finish that researching in that one, head back to 1940. Find them in the 1940 census. Remember, particularly for women, they could be in their family, they could be in their parents' household under a maiden name. So just keep that in mind. But you want to track them back, 1940, 1930, and you can keep going backwards in that way. And you will find earlier generations as well. Now, one thing to note, those 1790 to 1840 census records, they actually only had head of households, and then everybody else was just really a check mark or a number under an age category. Typically, these heads of households were going to be the men, okay, men. But the one I wanted to put one here in front of you, this is Sarah Blanks, and notice that she is a woman, okay. That tells us a little bit about Sarah, okay. She's probably a widow. In this case, she was. But it does tell us, I did want to point out that sometimes just because you had a female ancestor, and I know we tend to think we don't find as many records for the women in this time period, that yes, she would have been in the census record and we can find her name there. But it's just a good example to understand that those earlier census records, we don't get as much information, but it's still a lot of valuable information. And I don't want you to be overwhelmed with all of the numbers there. I will link to some other census videos that I have done in the description below, so that if this is something that you are struggling with, that you get there and you're not quite sure about, you can have a little bit more detail on doing census research. So wanted to point that out to you. All right. Now, certainly you want to read about the newspapers. Now, I have to be honest, this is something, once you've done the vital record research, you found out what the family knows, you've done your vital records, you've done your census research, that's a fabulous place to start. But I actually made a really big mistake in my early genealogy research, and that is the fact that I did not get into newspaper research sooner. I left it till much later in my research process, basically when I exhausted everything else, and I absolutely had no other clue or other research record I could research in, and that was a mistake. And so I actually now recommend that once you get through those first stages, that we go directly into newspaper research. Now, why? Why do I say that? Well, let's take a peek real quick. Okay, so this is an example. This is actually out of the some research I was doing in newspapers.com. And what I was specifically looking for here was what was happening in the community. What was happening, and see how this is actually obviously a Christmas Eve. This is a holiday type of time period, but see that little town talk? Okay, here it is over here. We have town talk. Now, what I love about town talk, and these could be called many things, but these smaller newspapers often would have this. And this one just happens to be out of Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina from 1933. And what we see is who's visiting whom and what's happening in the community. So here we have people visiting. So we have Mr. and Mrs. Buck Taylor and children, and Mr. and Mrs. C.E. Page. They spent Thursday in High Point. Well, that's kind of interesting. So they're moving around a little bit. We have, look at this one over here on the far right. We have Mrs. G.T. Pierce, Miss Ellen Pierce of Suffolk, Virginia, our guest of Miss Nellie Mae Jernigan. Now, it's interesting. Maybe they're friends, maybe they're family. We don't know, but that would give us a little bit of a clue. So we can start to see where people are visiting to go for. Here's one, an interesting one here, right here in the middle. Perry Mills was called to Camden Monday on account of the death of his wife. That's a very unfortunate thing. But what it tells us is that his wife was in Camden. Why was his wife in Camden? Was she visiting family? But we know to look for her death record in Camden now. So this is an important clue if we're struggling to find that death record for this woman who actually didn't die, and locally she actually died while visiting somebody apparently. So this is the type of information that we can find and get clues when it comes to researching our ancestors. Some people do tend to think this is a little bit the next level of genealogy research, but I just find that once you've done and you've gotten your research under your skills under you, as far as knowing what's already in the family, you've been looking for those vital records, you're looking through those census records, it makes sense to me to go ahead and check out the local newspapers to make sure you're not missing some clues. The other thing is that you would also have an opportunity to really get to know the community where your ancestor lived. That is a step that I really, truly, truly missed early in my own research. I didn't understand the community where my ancestors lived, and therefore I was missing some vital clues in finding my ancestors. And I really was spinning my wheels for quite a while there on a couple of my ancestral lines. So once I got into the newspapers, I was like, this makes sense. Now I understand what was happening in the community. I understand what was happening in the world. I understand why they left the area. And then I understood why they came back to the area. So it made a lot of sense once I started reading the newspapers. Okay, so one of the things I want you to remember when it comes to researching genealogy is you're just getting started. Make sure you know what the family knows. Go after the vital records. Go into the census research, and then start reading the newspaper and understand the community where your ancestors lived. Because if you start well, you're going to set yourself up for success down the line. Now, I want you to, if you want to learn more about how to set up a successful genealogy research plan on the clues that you find, be sure and watch the video on your screen now.